Dobrodošli u Agendu Svijet. U proteklim danima uzdrmano je transatlantsko savezništvo, a mnogi su se i zapitali jesu li Sjedinjene Američke Države promijenile stranu i postale saveznik Rusije. I dok se neke izjave predsjednika Trumpa i mnogih utjecajnih republikanaca bitno razlikuju, Europa je, čini se, konačno shvatila da je najbolji jamac svoje sigurnosti ona sama. A da bismo bolje razumjeli kako razmišlja sadašnji stanovnik Bijele kuće, pomoći će nam naš gost Johnom Sitilides, geopolitički stručnjak iz Washingtona, koji je radio kao konzultant u State Departmentu tijekom nekoliko američkih administracija. Mr. Sitilides, welcome to our program.
It's great to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. First, as a reminder, we will have a short overview of what have been said over the past few days. So let's watch.
Ovaj 38-godišnji ukrajinski vojnik prije 2 godine ostao je bez obje ruke i lijeve noge na fronti. Od trenutka strašne eksplozije zbog koje je ostao invalid, znao je da će se, ako preživi, vratiti na bojište.
Життя – це виклик. І тільки той, хто приймає виклики і бореться з ними, він живий. Проще за все лягти на ліжко і заплакати: мамо, я бідолашка.
Mnoge ukrajinske brigade imaju najmanje jednog, a često i nekoliko vojnika s amputiranim dijelovima tijela koji su još na aktivnoj dužnosti. Oni su među 380.000 vojnika ranjenih tijekom trogodišnjeg rata. Oko 46.000 njihovih suboraca je poginulo, deseci tisuća vode se kao nestali i zarobljeni. Kijev se ne suočava samo s izazovima na bojnom, nego i na diplomatskom polju. Njezin dosadašnji saveznik SAD o primirju pregovara s Rusijom, ostavljajući Ukrajinu i Europsku uniju po strani. Opća skupština UN-a donijela je rezoluciju u kojoj se potvrđuje potpora Ukrajini i njezinoj teritorijalnoj cjelovitosti, ali uz Rusiju protiv rezolucije glasao je i SAD. Unatoč golemim razlikama u stajalištima, Donald Trump i Emmanuel Macron žele surađivati kako bi se rat u Ukrajini priveo kraju. Trump je rekao da bi rat mogao završiti u nekoliko tjedana, te da bi Putin mogao dopustiti stacioniranje europskih mirovnih snaga u Ukrajini kao dio potencijalnog mirovnog sporazuma.
Si on ne garantit pas la sécurité de cette part du territoire de l'Europe, comment garantir notre propre sécurité à tous? Nous vivons à 1500 km de l'Ukraine, nous Français. Et c'est encore plus près quand on est évidemment polonais ou allemand. Donc c'est notre engagement pour la sécurité collective. Et en quelque sorte, c'est répondre aussi à l'appel qui nous est fait. Vous devez, vous, autres Européens, être davantage engagés. Mais nous, Américains, nous restons en solidarité. On le fait en Ukraine et on doit le faire aussi pour notre sécurité collective.
Bijela kuća pritom očekuje da Zelenski potpiše dogovor prema kojem bi SAD-u dao pristup ukrajinskim prirodnim bogatstvima u ime otplate više od 180 milijardi američkih dolara isporučenih Kijevu od početka rata 2022.
I support the idea to have Ukraine first being compensated because they are the one to have lose a lot of their fellow citizens and being destroyed by these attacks. Second, all of those who paid for could be compensated, but not by Ukraine, by Russia, because they were the one to aggress.
Again, just so you understand, Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid. We paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear. We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super.
Donald Trump prije je otvoreno ucjenjivao Vladimira Zelenskog gubitkom zemlje ako ne pristane na dogovor.
He refuses to have elections. It's low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh no, his polls are good. Give me a break. Every city is being demolished. They look like a demolition site, every single one of them. And the only thing he was really good at was playing Joe Biden like a fiddle. He played him like a fiddle. That's an expression we use, Yasser, to say that he's pretty easy. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left.
Uz to je iznio niz neistina. Od toga da Zelenski ima potporu samo 4% Ukrajinaca do toga da je Kijev zapravo kriv za početak rata.
У нас є докази, що ці цифри вони обговорюються між Америкою і Росією. Ну, тобто, на жаль, президент Трамп з великою повагою до нього відносимося як до лідера народу, який ми дуже поважаємо, американський народ, який нас постійно підтримує. На жаль, живе в цьому дезінформаційному просторі.
Nakon Trumpovih napada, nevladine organizacije izdale su priopćenje u kojem stoji da ukrajinski konsenzus o održavanju izbora najranije 6 mjeseci nakon kraja rata podupiru i vlasti i oporba. U 169% Ukrajinaca smatra da bi Zelenski trebao ostati do tada na vlasti. Analitičari ističu da Trump zapravo ponavlja zahtjeve Moskve za održavanjem izbora, koja se želi riješiti Zelenskog, destabilizirati političku situaciju i potencijalno postaviti ruske marionete na vlast.
I mean, a dictator. First, when I heard about this, then I was sure that he's making a mistake and mixing the two people, because Putin hasn't had elections, or Russia hasn't had elections in 25 years. Zelensky is elected leader, elected in free and fair elections.
Ako se SAD i ne slaže s ciljem Kremlja da Ukrajini postavi proruskog predsjednika, Trump bi im svojim potezima mogao i nenamjerno pomoći. Njegov animozitet prema ukrajinskom predsjedniku začet 2019. kad je Zelenski odbio istražiti ukrajinsku tvrtku povezanu s Hunterom Bidenom, pojačan je odbijanjem Kijeva da potpiše sporazum kojim bi SAD-u pripalo 50% ukrajinskih minerala. Washington naime zauzvrat nije ponudio nikakva sigurnosna jamstva, zato je Moskva zadovoljna razvojem situacije.
Мы, кстати говоря, готовы были бы предложить и американским нашим партнерам, когда я партнеры говорю, имею в виду не только административные, правительственные структуры, но и компании, если бы они проявили интерес к совместной работе. У нас, безусловно, на порядок, я хочу это подчеркнуть, на порядок больше ресурсов подобного рода, чем в Украине.
Our teams are already working productively with the U.S. on economic agreement, which we hope to sign in Washington. And President Trump, we would really like to hear from you, because all of our people, all our families are very worried. Will there be support from America? Will America be the leader of the free world?
Vrtoglava brzina transformacije američke politike prema Ukrajini i Rusiji ostavila je mnoge Ukrajince umorne od rata u strahu da će dogovor koji su iznudili Washington i Moskva rezultirati izgubljenim teritorijem i ranjivošću na buduću rusku agresiju.
Okay, Mr. Sitilides, you were a diplomacy consultant to the Department of State under 4 presidents, all of them in 21st century. So Biden, Trump, Obama, and Bush. You're probably the right person to tell us. You know, here in Europe right now, lots of people seem to think that latest statements from Donald Trump could end or signal the end of 80 years of transatlantic alliance. Is he really aligning with Russia? What do you think?
Well, there are several dimensions to your question that I'd like to address. First of all, the fact that we've had 80 years of transatlantic alliance doesn't mean that we're going to have another 80 years the way we've known it. The world has changed radically since the end of World War II. We suffered, as did the people of Croatia, under decades of the Cold War and the separation of Europe into two halves. That was ended over 30 years ago. But we've had a relatively peaceful period since the early 1990s. But I think the major disruptive forces on the world stage really have been the rise of Xi Jinping and a very belligerent China over the last 10 to 12 years. And now, of course, Russian adventurism in Ukraine, in Georgia, and the larger concerns in Europe about the security architecture of the continent going forward. And against this backdrop of a number of changes that have been happening before Donald Trump became president, he is looking to see how the United States realigns its relationship with Russia and to try to resolve the invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of life for everyday Ukrainians over the last 11, 12 years in a way that brings about a greater harmonization of U.S.-Russia interests bilaterally across Europe, and where there's a new security architecture in Europe that addresses Russian concerns, American concerns, and European concerns, because 2025 is a very different world than 1945 or even 1995.
Does majority of Republicans, those who create policies in Congress, the Senate, governors in U.S. states, are supporting this shift in relations towards Europe or other allies of the United States?
It all depends on the particular issue. There are many Republicans who are still very much committed to the way we've known doing foreign policy, the way we've been comfortable for decades. But unfortunately, as I just highlighted, the world has been changing, and the United States needs to change with the world. And under Donald Trump, his vision is for America to lead the changes in the world. The U.S.-China relationship, U.S.-Russia, U.S.-Europe, and even with our friends here in the Western Hemisphere, many Republicans are still very much committed to a certain way of doing things. More and more Republicans seem to be coming around to the Trump vision for rethinking international relations. And of course, several of those established members are now members of his administration, starting, of course, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and former Congressman Mike Waltz, who is his national security advisor. So it's going to take, I think, more persuasion and possibly some victories on the diplomatic stage. But more and more Republicans, I believe, are coming around to this. But it's still going to be a challenge for many, especially the older members of the Republican Party in the Senate and in the House of Representatives.
Do you think, as obviously many people do, that Trump changed his rhetoric towards Ukraine and particularly President Zelensky after his phone call with Vladimir Putin? Or he was just frustrated with Kyiv because it didn't respond positively to his proposals?
Well, let's, of course, begin with the fact that neither I nor anyone can read President Trump's mind, or the mind of anyone else for that matter. All we can do is try to divine by his statements and by his actions of recent days, recent months, and frankly, going back a number of years. It seems to me that Donald Trump believes that Ukrainian President Zelensky had an opportunity to bring about a peace in Ukraine 1 month after the Russian invasion in February of 22. In March of 2022, you had 90% of an agreement in place between Moscow and Kyiv, and then Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, probably at the urging of U.S. President Joe Biden, went to Kyiv and told Zelensky to not sign the document, that the United Kingdom, the NATO alliance, and especially the United States would continue to provide whatever arms Ukraine needed to prevail, to, in a very delusional way, potentially win over the massive Russian military. And so I think Trump blames Zelensky for not taking that peace deal in 2022. And certainly since September of 2022, when we saw the very daring Ukrainian counteroffensive, there's really been no significant movement between Russia and Ukraine throughout eastern Ukraine for 2.5 years. What you have really is World War I type trench warfare, hundreds of thousands of young Russian and Ukrainian men dead, injured, maimed for life, and really no exit strategy for this war by either side. And I think what happened most recently, despite the fact that you have had this, I think, antipathy by President Trump towards President Zelensky, I think it was very foolish of Zelensky to publicly, well, try to humiliate or ridicule Donald Trump by talking about him operating in a sphere of Russian disinformation. And I think that's what triggered the more sort of caustic remarks by President Trump several days ago, calling Zelensky a dictator and a modestly successful comedian and whatnot. It's not smart to humiliate Trump, whether one respects him, fears him, or hates him. If you're the president of a country utterly dependent on the United States for your survival, it's probably not smart to ridicule the man who leads that country's government.
Okay, I just may add, as far as I remember, first Donald Trump called Zelensky dictator and talked about 4% of approval in Ukraine for him. And then it was this remark that Donald Trump lives in the sphere of Russian influence. But anyway, do you think that knowing all of that, that we are getting closer right now, and obviously Donald Trump is the one who's pushing the ceasefire agreement and probable peaceful solution long-term for Ukraine. Are we getting closer right now with that?
Well, we're certainly closer than we were a month ago because, unfortunately, the Biden administration decided to never communicate with Vladimir Putin. And so there's really no way you're going to bring about a peace settlement if you don't speak to your main adversary. But it's going to be a very, very challenging process. And, of course, one thinks back to when then candidate Trump was talking about resolving the Russian invasion of Ukraine in one day, he tends to be quite hyperbolic in his comments, in his rhetoric. But I think they are very serious about moving as rapidly and as energetically as they can to bring about a ceasefire. And President Trump believes, and I don't know if he's right or wrong, that once you have a ceasefire, it's very unlikely that either party will revert to hostilities. So we'll see if this plays out in the days or more realistically in the weeks ahead. We hope they do. It'll be good for Russia and good for Ukraine to end the bloodletting and to see how we rebuild the Ukrainian economy, provide a decent society for the Ukrainian people, and let the Russian people have a normal economy again, not one that is cut off from the Western world and increasingly dependent on the Communist Party of China for its well-being.
You already said that you cannot look into the head of Donald Trump or anybody else, but could you comment, let's ask this more broadly, not only on Ukraine and the relationship with Europe and other allies, but it looks to me that Mr. Trump believes that all U.S. politics, basically in the past, let's say 20 years, both domestic and foreign, were wrong, and he now wants to fundamentally change all of them. Do you agree with that, and do you believe that this is how things should be done?
It may seem that way because he is taking on so many of our traditional foreign policy perspectives and policies and strategies over the past decades in a very, very compressed period of time, right? He's only been U.S. president for a number of weeks. But I think those areas of American foreign policy and, frankly, our domestic economy that he sincerely believes need to be reformed, he's targeting for reform. Those that are beyond reform, he will probably seek to dismantle and to rebuild. And certainly he feels, as do many Americans, including our political leaders before Trump was reelected, that it was a very foolish strategy on the part of American leaders going back to the Clinton administration to facilitate the growth of the Chinese Communist Party in the mistaken belief that as China became more prosperous and militarily more powerful, that it would join the United States in the so-called international rules-based liberal order, become more consensual, more liberalized, and become a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder. Maybe one of the most foolish diplomatic blunders in modern history on the part of America's leaders towards China. And I think especially now with the Ukraine war, I think President Trump's perspective is it's foolish to drive Russia closer into the arms of the Communist Party of China. What we should be doing is swallowing some very difficult pills, but recognizing that it's in America's and Europe's interest that Russia is not beholden to China, but that there's some type of a condominium between Moscow and NATO, Moscow and the European Union, Moscow and all the peoples of Europe, and look to see how we remake that relationship. And in the Middle East, the idea that Iran is on the cusp of a nuclear weapon that not only can destroy the state of Israel, but also extort and blackmail Sunni Arab countries whose oil and natural gas power the economies of Europe and Asia is a foolish place for the United States, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East to be. And so he's looking to remake the Middle East in a way that brings about greater stability, greater peace, and protects the trade routes upon which Europe and Asia are so dependent.
You already said previously that Donald Trump and his administration moves really fast and very energetically since the January 20th. Obviously, a little bit over 1 month, they're done so many things and so many decisions are made. But could you tell us who creates these policies and agendas of his administration? Is that there one think tank or somehow works differently?
No, I don't think it's any one entity, any one individual. I mean, I genuinely believe that many of these larger visions are Donald Trump's. One only has to go to YouTube and look at interviews he's given freely and openly for decades about the mistakes that he believes that American leaders have made with our domestic economy, with our trade relations, with our trade deficits, with China, with Russia, with NATO, with the Iraq war, and the like. He's been thinking this way for years and for decades. I think what's different now is that in many ways he seemed very unprepared for the decision-making apparatus of the White House and the massive federal bureaucracy of the United States government in 2017 when he was first elected president. But I think he's learned. He's also become, I believe, a lot wiser in terms of his outlook on the American economy and the international arena after he survived a near assassination in July of last year. And I think age, experience, wisdom have all come together. And, you know, there's still half of America that loves him and half of America that hates him. And there may be that kind of a division for peoples around the world as well. But I think the one difference is that this time around, he had put together a stable, a roster of extraordinarily skilled and experienced policy planners who since 2021, when Joe Biden came into the White House, have been planning for 4 years for the possible return of Donald Trump to the White House. They have been preparing the sort of putting the flesh to the bone of many of these Trump visions for international relations, for diplomacy, and for American domestic economic reforms. They're the ones who have been drafting these executive orders so that from day one, he has signed, I believe now, more than 100 executive orders that are affecting almost every aspect of the American economy and reordering our relations with so many important countries and regions around the world. So let's just say he's been extraordinarily well prepared coming into this second administration in a far superior manner than he was in 2017. And that's why I believe his agenda will be far more successfully implemented in the months ahead, certainly through the end of 2026. And then we'll see what happens with the congressional elections and whether or not Republicans retain power in both the Senate and the House, or if the Democratic Party takes over one or both houses. And then we have a new political dynamic in Washington in the second 2 years of Trump's administration.
And finally, I have to ask you about one specific member of this team, the Donald Trump's administration. I would say the obvious superstar so far, Mr. Elon Musk. How do you see his role and how do you assess what he has done through Doge so far, obviously?
Yeah, it's a very unusual arrangement that President Trump has implemented with Elon Musk as a special government employee and maybe one of his most respected advisors. And I think Donald Trump looks at Elon Musk's extraordinary, singular, unique success as an entrepreneur, the level of efficiency he's brought to his companies, whether it's SpaceX or Tesla or the Boring Company, or obviously with Twitter, where he fired 90% of the workforce, and Twitter is a far more successful company today than it was when 90% of the people were doing nothing except putting videos on YouTube and on Twitter and on TikTok, for that matter, about all of their milkshakes and, you know, gymnasium activities. So I think he's looking to bring that kind of ruthless efficiency to the federal government. I think also the fact that Elon Musk is extraordinarily skilled in terms of all of the most advanced technologies, which Donald Trump believes the United States must be the world leader in, whether it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and all of the very cutting-edge frontier technologies that are going to be important in the U.S.-China relationship and for American global economic dominance, which Donald Trump firmly and devoutly believes in. And I think also, lastly, he admires the daring vision that Elon Musk brings to every adventure. Elon Musk, if one simply reads the biographies, the very famous one, for instance, by Walter Isaacson, is somebody who brings a break things first and ask forgiveness later approach, rather than take the safe regulatory approach and make sure that you are, you know, abiding by the book, abiding by the rules. And so it's a very different approach to the federal government. But so far, he seems to have retained the confidence of Donald Trump. And as long as President Trump feels that Elon Musk is doing an excellent job of reducing waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government and setting a right example for maximizing efficiency so that everything that the federal government and its bureaucracies do serve and advance the national interest of the United States, I think Elon Musk will be in a comfortable place as long as, of course, he has the time to do so while he's still CEO of Tesla and SpaceX and the Boring Company and X and other leading technology companies.
Definitely interesting 4 years ahead of US and the rest of the world. Mr.
Sure, of course.
Sitilides, thank you very much for these insights and this interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hvala i vama, cijenjene gledateljice i gledatelji. Bila je to još jedna Agenda svijeta. Do idućeg tjedna. Doviđenja.